Hello everybody, welcome. We hope you're having a nice day today at the St. Lucie County Regional History Center. My name is Sinnott. I'm here today with the Florida Remembered Society, and we want to welcome you to a taste of the Treasure Coast Pioneer food history. Just a few words about Florida Remembered Society. We are a nonprofit group very interested in preserving, protecting, promoting, and very passionate about our history. So it's all about the history that we love so much. We are here today with this program. This is a precursor to the upcoming Red, White, and Food exhibition that we will have in 2026 to celebrate our nation's 250th birthday. And why do I say 250th birthday? Because I can't pronounce all those other words for 250. Too many different ones, I can't pronounce them. So I wanted to tell you this program is part of the Smithsonian exhibition Starter Kit Food. It's a collaboration between the Smithsonian Institution and Florida Humanities. Support for this program was provided through a grant from Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Florida Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. In other words, if I give you indigestion talking about Pioneer foods, they have nothing to do with it, okay? So moving on, all right? First of all, we're talking about Pioneer food. What is a pioneer, Florida pioneer? All right, anybody here think that they're from a family of pioneers? Okay, Joyce back there, yes, she's a yes, all right, possibly, all right. So the state defines a pioneer as those who can trace their family roots in Florida before 1900. Now, as a historian, as a local historian, a student of history here, we used to say a pioneer were people who lived here before the train arrived in 1894. So there are two different definitions of a pioneer, but we'll go with the state definition. Okay, why is food such an important part of our history? And I realize I'm not using the microphone, am I? Does that help any? Why is food history so important to us?
We couldn't have done it, don't eat, we die.
Right? Well, without it, we are history, right? Okay, that's true. Okay, but food is such a basic part of our life, but it tells so much about who we are as human beings, about our values, our lifestyles, even our religious beliefs, what we are like as humanitarians. Food goes back to our family stories, the recipes we share and that we know and we love. It tells us so much about our own communities, certain characters, and certainly our work ethics. Food is definitely related to that. So truly, we are what we eat. That is very important. We eat what we are. Okay, the program today is based on a wonderful little story by Emily Legault Bell. I don't know if you're familiar with it. You can find it online. It's less than 60 pages that gives you so much insight into what pioneer East Coast Florida was like. The name of her book, which she wrote in 1929, 50 years after she had originally arrived here, is called My Pioneer Days in Florida from 1876 through 1898. Oh, there, he's got the book up there, okay. If you have a chance, please read the book. It's a delight for those who study history because many times we do not know what people ate. If you think about it, it's such a basic part of our life, we often include it in our history. So this woman provided us such a great insight into what people ate, and I have to tell you that Florida historians do gobble that information up because it's a wonderful piece of history of what we ate. All right, so let's get started here. Emily arrived here in 1876.
She was a Yankee, and you have to remember this time period in Florida is after the end of the Civil War. You have many people who are coming to Florida, and as we know, and even today, people come to Florida for their health. Emily, her sisters, and her mother followed their father here to Florida. He had arrived a bit earlier for health reasons. He had rheumatism. He wasn't what was called a consumptive Yankee, those who had tuberculosis. He had rheumatism, and he found that in Florida he was doing much better. So they arrived, and think about this, from Illinois to Florida, to East Coast Florida, to Titusville, 9 days on a train. Then to Jacksonville, then a smaller train, then on to the St. Johns River on a small little steamer, then over to Enterprise, then across the haulover on basically a pony-pulled cart, open cart, and they arrive in what was called early Titusville, Sandy Point, or sometimes you see it City Point too. Needless to say, when Emily arrived after the 6 hours that day, she was in her cart coming across with her family, she was very thirsty. And the first thing that happens is she sees a nice spring of water and goes over there to get a drink quickly, and oh, what kind of water do you think it was? Sulfur water. All right, does anybody here like drinking sulfur water? Some people don't mind. I know they don't really catch that rotten egg smell. Emily definitely did, but fortunately there was an orange grove nearby. She arrived in November, so there were oranges, and she was offered oranges. She thought she was going to have to pay 10 cents a piece for them, which they had done in Illinois. But that didn't happen because there was an abundance, and the man said, take all you want. So she was able to quench her thirst. Now, the other thing was, yes, there are plenty of freshwater springs in Florida, so there was plenty for her to find to drink. And there were wells. And of course, there was one thing that everybody had every single day. Whether as a child you would learn to drink it, it was coffee. Lots and lots of coffee. So you'd be drinking it, what was called 4-day coffee, while it was still dark. Before the sun came up, you'd start drinking coffee, and maybe you would have 5 cups of coffee a day. They say with some of the cow hunters, they might have as many as 4 or 5 quarts a day. And the coffee, coffee, coffee. And you can imagine too, drinking all that coffee would help to quell and to stop some of your hunger too. And Emily wasn't quite so sure what she was getting into in the way of what did these people eat, because when they were on the train and they had gotten to Georgia, they heard some railroad workers talking, and they were very excited. They were going to catch a possum and have some possum and taters. And Emily and her sister giggled like, ooh, what are they talking about? But little did she realize when she got here that that would be a regular supplement in the diet. Anybody here ever had possum and taters? They say that possum tastes like pork, like a young suckling pig, and it tastes pretty good. And there was definitely an abundance of sweet potatoes that they had here.
How you doing? You doing okay? All right. Along with the freshwater springs in Titusville, I just want to let you know about this. There were lots of watering holes. And by watering holes, I mean there were lots of saloons. You have to keep in mind that East Florida was kind of like the Wild West a little bit. I like to call it the exciting East. So long before you had any churches in most little towns, you had a couple saloons, a couple watering holes, and in Titusville it was no exception. There were actually 10 different saloons the time when she arrived,
but not a church to be found, not a single house of worship, but lots of watering holes. Now, you notice I'm going to be talking about who were some of these people, who were some of these other pioneers. And what's very important to note is these people needed to work together. A neighbor might have lived 3 miles away, but helping your neighbor, sharing with your neighbor, caring for your neighbor, taking care of your neighbor when he or she was sick was so essential. All right, anybody recognize this guy up here on the map? All right, can you see? You can't see it? All right, we have Hendry's. About this time, we have Hendry's in this area. You can go down, hon. We have Summerlin's coming to the area. You get an idea. A lot of men wearing beards, but that must have been horrible when the sandflies came out. That's all I can think of them getting in. You had dealings with the Seminoles. There's Polly Parker, she and Lucy Parker, and Aunt Nance, as she was called. On down, you would have, at this period of time, you would have also had steamboat captains dealing with, especially Captain Bravo was known all over. Again, coming down this way, you see the aldermans were here, and we just heard from an alderman a little while ago. So you had all different pioneer families here. And keep going down. You get an idea of simple lifestyle, palmetto brush. Now that's a fancy house for the times. All right, we'll keep going down. Out in the woods, you might have had 2 homes. One that was on the river. Remember, most people lived the life on the lagoon. The lagoon provided for them, but they also had their cattle. This was a huge time of people working cattle and cow hunting, and so you would have had a house out in the woods too, but none of them very fancy. House in the woods, and here's the original Michael home on Orchid Island, because we are talking about the whole Treasure Coast area, so we want to include North Vero area too. The Carlton family, still here, still living here, beautiful picture. Blacks and whites living together. People of all different family sizes, some in covered wagons still. The Seminoles with their star fire. You see them cooking with their star fire. Otherwise, you might be cooking just out in the open in a fireplace, or if you were lucky, like Emily was, a year or so after she got married, she had a wood stove to cook on, and the wood stove provided wonderful way to cook savory flavors along with your cast iron, and a way to keep your dinner kept warm for supper. There was a special closet in the cook stove. Oh, we got some more people. You would have had a steady stream during the cooler months of visitors, just like we do, right? We have our snowbirds. Only keep in mind that most all of the traffic, everything happened along the lagoon. It was tough there weren't really good trails out in the woods, so life on the lagoon, and a lot of people camping and finding out what is this Florida like, and they certainly ate very well. And here's the Pierce family from the Martin County area too. Leaf has probably seen a picture of this, okay? What else do we have here? Tommy Tiger, and we have the others visiting, and notice they're holding the granddaughter of Mr. Hill, holding Catherine Hill. So this is what life was like. Now, Emily coming here, it was a whole change of lifestyle, but what is so amazing is that within months after they arrive here, they're out shooting squirrels. She and her sister are shooting squirrels for their dinner. They're gathering what they call Indian squashes, small pumpkins, and she did that one afternoon, was chased by an alligator. They also, at one point, there's a bear that comes in the yard to get after their hogs that they did have, and the mother actually shoots the bear, but didn't have much of a shot. They had small shot, so a neighbor has to finish off the bear. So all of these provided foods for them to eat. Recognize this guy? All right. This is William Tucker, and he came in the 1880s, the 1890s to Fort Pierce. He had actually served at the Fort Capron earlier, so he came here. He started a local saloon here. His son did. It was called Goss Tucker's Saloon, and we always look at this picture and saying, what is he posed for? He definitely was big in the Democratic Committee. He was a very generous man. He took some of his earnings from Goss's saloon, from the Tarpon Saloon as it was called, and he gave it toward the church, and he also helped to take care of old veterans. So a good guy, but somewhat of a character too. He did at one time consider running against Napoleon Bonaparte to be the governor, but decided against it. He liked his home. So here you have an idea of his idea of a fun mimicking of what a pioneer looked like on the ox. Okay, now, the foods that were eaten mostly came from animals with fur, fins, feathers, and there were fruit and vegetables. Emily and the other pioneers ate bear roast, possum roast, manatee roast, deer, turkey, green turtles, oysters, clams, hogs, lots of white bacon for fat, cooking fat to make your gravy, for your canned tomatoes, sweet potatoes, sweet potatoes, sweet potatoes, corn, wild squash, wild berries, oranges, huckleberries, mangoes, guava, alligator pears, also known as avocado, palmetto cabbage. Have I forgotten anything? Does any of it make you hungry? Maybe, maybe not yet. Okay. All right. So, hunting and fishing were very important. Of course, hunting was certain times of the year. All right. So you get an idea from the Summerlin collection. Has anybody ever heard about all the ducks that would be on the waters here? That it was practically black, covered with what they called coots, C-O-O-T-S. There's so many ducks. So here's a picture from the Summerlin collection, and I think the one before it showed it was only two hours of hunting, and that's how many ducks they got. Okay, we'll move on down. Can you tell what's in the front here? A bear from the Barrier Island, all right, and that's not why they call it the Barrier Island, but that's a bear from the Barrier Island, a common to kill bears and have a good bear roast, but not in the spring, not a good time. We'll keep on going down. Again, we have another bear. This is definitely Summerlin family, and it looks like that may be Jim Russell. They would serve as guides when visitors came and take people out bear hunting, gator hunting, and take them fishing for tarpon. They love to fish for tarpon. So guides definitely kept busy, could make some money. Here you have some deer on the front, on the bow of getting ready to roast it up. And this was the amazing thing about these people. You can keep going down, huh? We got women there with guns. Be nice, all right? No, women, all right, and I love this picture. Not only does she have her rifle and her dog, but she's wearing a boa made out of, can anybody tell what it is? Spanish moss. It's Spanish moss. Now that is somewhat of a fashion risk, all right, especially with the red bugs, but I doubt there were any in there. Probably nice and clean, taken right from the tree. All right, moving along. Fishing, we know, was the finest. We know that brought people, we brought the senators and the politicians to this area to fishing an abundance. I cannot stress enough the abundance of Florida lands and waters at this time. Nobody had to starve unless you weren't working hard enough. So we see all ages. You would have learned as a young boy or girl how to use the cast net. Very important, especially when the mullet were running, when it was mullet row season, and many children, backing up just a minute, like that, who did not know their numbers and letters, because remember, we didn't have schools, oftentimes maybe a school in somebody's home, but those who did not know their numbers and letters knew how old they were. They knew if it was another season of row mullet, they were another year older. If it was another year, if it was another season for picking oranges, they were another year older. That's kind of a nice way to know your age, isn't it? How many seasons of oranges you've been through. Sawfish. We see lots and lots of pictures in the past of sawfish. There's one picture, and I'm glad I don't have it to show, but they actually have a picture and they have 10 baby sawfish on display, and you think, well, no wonder we don't really see them around much anymore. I guess it was such an unusual fish to catch, they wanted to get a picture of it and record it. There's another one. So sometimes we have to think about what we do affects the future way down the road. Okay, I haven't talked about grits yet. How many of you eat grits? All right, regularly? All right. You know what was the strangest thing this morning? I was going through my notes and kind of listening to the news, and they talked about in Atlanta where they've had a freeze and they were working on the roads. They put salt down on the roads and they put grits down. This is just like yesterday for traction. Have you ever heard of such a thing? But you imagine when that snow melts, you got a mixture of the salt and the grits. Maybe it's a free meal. I have never heard of such a thing. In fact, I heard the grits. I said, oh my gosh, I've been looking at my notes too long, thinking about grits. Grits, 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 and more grits. That is what they ate. And of course, you might have gone shopping and had a big barrel of corn, a big barrel of grits, if it was already ground, and maybe flour, if you were lucky. Most every meal had grits. So we actually had what was called a circuit rider here in the late 1800s saying, let's just think of them as something else. So in the morning, maybe they would call them hominy. In the evening, at dinner time in the afternoon, they'd call it rice, and at dinner time, it would be grits. So they tried to give them different names just to make it a little more palatable. But other ways they did that was they mixed lime juice or orange juice with the grits. They would sometimes add fish, of course. They would add pieces of mullet to the grits. They would serve it hot, and then you might have it left over cold. And one time, as they often did, they were scavengers. A lot of times they would go down to the beach to see what they could scavenge. They found a lot of coconuts. So Emily's mother takes these coconuts and grates them up and gets the milk and adds them to the grits and a little bit of sugar, and she said it was really very delicious. They would eat this coconut on the grits as well as on the bread her mother baked for about 2 weeks. They had a steady diet of coconut. Who knows what this is? All right, did you say dough bowl? Yes, it's a dough bowl. Baking. This was a gift to my husband Paul and to me when we were married over 40 years ago, made by the Cherokee Indians. At this time, as a pioneer, having a dough bowl would have been very important for you when baking of your breads. It might have been a bigger dough bowl. But baking breads was an essential skill to know, and a dough bowl like that might have become a family heirloom passed through the generations. Does anybody have a dough bowl that Joyce, you do? Okay, I figured you did. And no, I don't really know how to bake bread. So this has been more for showing and not for baking. All right, moving along to citrus. As I said, this was at a time after Dummett had started his groves. We would have had nice sweet, not just sour oranges. We would have had sweet oranges. And that was a very, very important as far as livelihoods and also for adding to flavors such as the grits and your baking orange juice in your dough to cook things up. But this was definitely the land of oranges, and we're very proud. The Indian River area has long been celebrated for its oranges and was reputed to be the finest fruit grown in the state. And this is a report in 1875, bragging about Indian River fruit. Go ahead and continue on. Of course, maybe bragging a little too much. Maybe that's an exaggeration, huh? All right, lovely, lovely lady. And you can see in the groves you would have all different people of all different backgrounds picking when it was time to pick, all right? So it's very important to know. So how did Emily come to live in this area? How did she end up in what would become the Fort Pierce area? Well, Emily seemed to be a very friendly people, and as I said, its pioneers took care of each other. Her friends decided that they would start a riverboat, a trade boat. And you have to remember, back during this time, if you made a trip from what is now Fort Pierce to Titusville, which before the arrival of the Hogues and what would later become the P.P. Cobb store, if you made a trip to get your dry goods, to go to the grocery, it could take about 10 days. So, and with your headwind, maybe 15. So now we complain about going grocery shopping and having to spend 15 minutes shopping. Back then it could be a 15-day ordeal. So of course you would buy for your neighbors too. Everyone would gather together, probably buying in large amount and sharing too. So Emily's friend decided he was going to have a trade boat. And you've got to remember that everybody was in the trade. If you had something to sell or something to barter or something to trade, you were basically in the trade. As the Seminoles would come into town, they would bring their honey, their hogs, they would bring their huckleberry, they would bring their hides, they would even bring beeswax and sometimes bear wax to help you protect you from the bugs, but everyone was in the trade business. So Emily rode south. It was a big ordeal, many days, and when they got to Fort Pierce, her friend opened up his boat. They would call into the conch shell. They would blow into the conch shell to let people know they were there. And who should arrive but a young man named James Bell. And when they first met, this captain, Emily's friend, was trying to see who would bring what for Emily. One man had come with just a few oranges, but Jim came to meet Emily and brought about 100 oranges in a box. She called them Golden Beauties, and it was love at first sight or first bite, you have to say. But the oranges won her over, and that's a lovely little story about how they met. He ended up coming back to meet her parents. That was a few months later. That was in 1878 they met. By 1879, Emily is probably 18 or 19 years old and is married and has moved to what isn't even the Fort Pierce area yet, not really even Cantown yet, just pioneers here on the lagoon. As they make their way back to this area, what's amazing is they are in a boat. but they stop and stop all along the ways. Everybody welcomes them. They spend the night. There's such a hospitality. But at every single house, guess what they're eating? Grits. So she gets to the point where they're making their way home, and she, in her book, she says, oh, she heard grinding and she thought it was going to be coffee. And they had already had problems with when they didn't have coffee. They had actually parched sweet potatoes, nice and dark, and mixed it with water and tried to make a coffee out of it. And they had done the same thing with corn to try to make a coffee out of parched corn when they did not have the real coffee beans, the roasted beans. So when she hears that grinding, she thinks it's going to be coffee beans, but instead it's grits, and she says, grits is tough and grits is rough, and oh God, I've had grits enough, all right? Except that she does change her mind a little bit when she gets to the Bell house and meets Alexander Bell. And he is someone in our local history, an admirable person, quiet, intelligent, hardworking. When she meets the family, they have grits, but they have grits with cow peas in them and with dried beef, which was so unusual to her. Does anybody know what cow peas are? Cow peas? Black-eyed peas, that's right. How many of you are lucky? Yeah. How many of you had black-eyed peas for the new year, for good luck? Oh, yay, good. Oh, that's a tradition. I don't know where that started in the South, but it's something, if we don't have black-eyed peas and cornbread and greens, we're just not going to be lucky. So Emily was so pleased to meet her new family and to sample this dried beef in the grits along with the cow peas. It was very unusual to her, but cow peas grew pretty well, just like the Indian pumpkins did, the Indian squash. So they were something, and just like the sweet potatoes, so that was something that could also be a part of their staple. Where they lived was just up here around Taylor, the creek here. But where they lived was not too far from the father. The house was basically built from what they scavenged on the beach, as well as palmetto fronds. Just basically a piece of canvas for the door. So it was very rough living, and she was cooking outside, doing her best, but finding that everything was sooty. Even though they constantly had smudge pots going, I guess the soot from the fire really bothered them. So she was so happy, as I said, about a year later when her mother and father moved to this area and bring her a wood stove that another person had left behind. They were moving back. Okay, we are moving on the cattle trail. Interesting to note, yes?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You mentioned beeswax and the bugs.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
I sure will. So it would have been beeswax. I'm not sure about the bug. I know they would use bear grease. And actually, when Emily and her newlywed husband were making their way back, they stopped at the house of the stewards who had someone who worked with him. He would use mullet. So they had the mullet, but he would wipe the mullet all over his skin to keep the bugs away during the day. Of course, his employer would require him to take some kind of bath before he went to bed. But I do know that the bear grease, and they probably mixed it with herbs. Probably the Seminoles would bring a special concoction. There were also what were called mosquito bars and smudges that you would have. But yes, they were a constant problem. And Emily, in her book, does note that it was the Seminoles who first came up with the name no-see-ums. That's what we tend to call sandflies all the time now. But they were the ones who said no-see-ums, and you can understand that because that would have been broken English that they would have used. So our no-see-ums were actually named by the Seminoles. Now, would I recommend that you rub a mullet all over your body to keep the bugs away? Not unless you want to keep your friends away, right? So they did try all different ways. I've read once where someone had actually covered himself in mud. So I think a lot depends what you get used to, but definitely sleeping at night, you needed what was a mosquito bar. It was a mesh net set up. You would tuck it underneath you, whether you were out cow hunting out in the woods, or whether you were in your palmetto shack, or whether you were in a nicer home here. And the other thing that they did, I will point out, is depending on the time of year, it sometimes can be confusing. Why, during the summer, would you head into the woods? There's one answer for that: no-see-ums, all right? Because you don't have them along the water the way you do. So that would have been a nice respite from the no-see-ums to go catch those open breezes on the prairie there during the summer. So those were some ways that they did try to protect themselves, and I'm sure there was every kind of herb or whatever they could do to cover themselves. The women, of course, had long sleeves, long dresses, but if you've ever been somewhere wearing a dress and the no-see-ums come up, they get everywhere. They can drive you crazy in a minute. So, all right, so back to the cattle trail. All right, the interesting thing is that reading, some of these people might have had hundreds of head of cattle, but yet they never slaughtered their first beef. All right, they did not eat the beef because to them, well, that cow, 800-pound cow, was worth about $5. So why would they kill it when they could get turkey, hog, they could get deer venison, where they could get oysters, a mess of mullet for free? Why would they spend that $5? And in this account also, the mother is complaining because when she goes to the general store, the cost is about $2.50 for her groceries. That sounds a pretty good deal to me. All right, on the cattle trail, what would you eat? All right, we know you'd be drinking a whole lot of coffee. Coffee to keep you awake, especially if you were in charge that night. If it was your, a tomato can. So you couldn't bring anything fancy. You might have a leftover can that you would have attached to your saddlebag. That was how you heated up your coffee. You'd bake up a lot of sweet potatoes. You might have gotten some biscuits someone made, and they sure would get hard, but you know, you would take your biscuits or your crackers that you would buy, and you usually would just crumble them up and put them right into your coffee. That's how you soften them up, and that's how you made your coffee more palatable, because most people did not drink sugar and milk, carnation milk, in their coffee. They drank it bare bones, and I know there are many other names for the way black coffee was called, but bare bones coffee was how you drank. Out in the woods here, a different lifestyle, and you have to imagine that most everyone had the opportunity to be in the cattle business, because there were still wild cattle. We did not have fences for many, many years. Here, locally, Tom Payne, from what is now the St. Lucie Village area, was said to be one of the first actual commercial cattle ranchers raising cattle. He had a range of about 200 miles. Can you believe that? That's a huge area, but most everywhere that hadn't been fenced in was owned by the government and was used. You could use it for cattle up until about 1949, when the final fence laws went through. Here you have what was often a sight is you have campers. We have our tourists coming to visit and getting a real taste of Florida out in the woods with a Seminole as well as with guides. Biscuits, bacon, and when I say bacon, they ate just the white part, just the fat part of the bacon, the grease. So everybody, whatever you read, is going to say it was the white bacon that they would cook up. That would make a nice grease to make yourself some tomato gravy. Let's go back a minute, Hannah. Syrup, maybe in a whiskey jug. maybe a little whiskey, who knows, all right? Most in Florida, you might find that your family accompanied you on a cattle drive. And when I say the cattle drive, keep in mind these people would mark their cattle, and maybe throughout the year they would check on their cattle, make sure no one's changed the brand or the earmark. And then about once a year they would take the cattle over to the West Coast where they were sold to Cuba for gold coins. That was for many years. There were people who did make a good living that way, but oftentimes you might have the family going all alongside of you. We interviewed someone not too long ago, and she remembers in the 40s, that would have been before the fence laws, accompanying her family on a cattle drive across the state. So coffee, sometimes as much as 3 or 4 quarts a day, helping you make those watches and night shifts. Crackers dipped in the coffee. Another important crop that we had in addition to the citrus, pineapples. Pineapples were king here for about 25, 30 years, from the late 1880s until about 1920. And you can imagine anywhere you're driving where you see the white sand hills, pineapples were likely grown there at this time. And pineapples, just like the citrus, just like the canned oysters from Cantown, just like the turtles that were also caught and sold for a very good price. We made wonderful turtle steaks here and turtle soup. They often would be hauled on the steamboats that were plying the river. So maybe a steamboat would come down with passengers and go back with pioneers. Come down with tourists and go back with turtles. Yes, live turtles being stored, all right, good money in the about 5, if you had maybe 1,000-pound green turtle, you'd probably end up getting about $50, which was a huge amount of money for these pioneers. But pineapples, and here's one thing, an early doctor, Dr. Anna Darrow, who went out to Okeechobee, recalls coming to Fort Pierce area, and there were pitchers of pineapple juice. And they were so very refreshing. It's like the pineapple owners would put out these pitchers, but they probably put them out with a little bit of sugar and the pineapple cores too, and the skins. And after a few days, those would start getting rather ripe and delicious and maybe making you feel good. They had a bit of an alcohol content to them, is what I'm saying. And so no wonder she enjoyed that first taste of pineapple juice, and that helped give her the energy to get across to Okeechobee. You'd see pineapples on the boat too. Now one thing, we're getting into leisure time. The one thing I love reading about these early peoples, especially Floridians and those who are in our beautiful Treasure Coast area, is the way they could have a pop-up party. None of this silly preparation. If somebody had a deer, well, you were going to have a cookout. You were all going to get together. Everyone was going to be there. Everyone would bring something, usually sweet potatoes or grits. Yeah, you're getting the idea. But leisure time, you can't have Jim with all his many different jobs. He needed to have his leisure time. So you would see functions like a gathering on the water down in Eden for Washington's birthday. There would have been a celebration of May Day, of the 1st of May. There would have been a celebration of the 4th of July. So anytime these people could get together and have a party, and usually a square dance, then people would bring food, and they would have a, what I call, pop-up party, enjoying each other's company. Whether they were going to go across to the barrier island to enjoy a picnic and maybe go visit Emily and her husband and family, who were actually the first keepers of the House of Refuge here at the Indian River Inlet in Fort Pierce. Again, along the water, enjoying the outings. Or this is the Michael family. up on an orchid, beautiful family photo, enjoying a picnic, and you get an idea by their dresses just how to date that. Here we have the ladies of the Presbyterian Church gathered along the lagoon here, and interesting is the whole, you can see where it says graham for graham crackers that they have as part of their picnic. Again, groups of families just learning how to relax. Sunday was a day for relaxing, and steamboats too, enjoying plying the river and carrying goods back and forth and bringing civilization here. I cannot stress enough about the general stores. Emily and her husband, he seemed to have every kind of job. At first I thought, what kind of bum was he? But then you realize they would just take advantage. Where was the opportunity? Where was the money? So he was a lighthouse keeper. He was a river pilot. He was a cow hunter. He was, he carried the post. He carried the mail. Probably met up with the barefoot mailman at one time in his travels. But he constantly seemed to have different jobs. And then I realized, well, this is what they had to do. They needed money. When they were actually out in the woods, they didn't have an opportunity to make money. And at one point, Emily is there, has a newborn baby, a couple weeks old, and her mother comes to see her, says, what are you doing? Why haven't you eaten? And it's because they didn't have much money to buy food. So her mother actually turns around, goes back into town, goes through a pond 5 miles back, 5 miles here, to bring some grits and some bacon, and they make some flapjacks, which was a real treat for her. Now, through the years, we can see as land gets cleared, there's more farming, dependable farming, which of course is still depending on the weather even today. Freezes could wipe out their turtle patch that they had, their turtle crawl, as it was called, a big pen for holding turtles so they could sell them. Freezes could also wipe out the fish. At one time, it is so cold here that the fish are all freezing on the water, and they don't know what to do with them, so they take them, and it's kind of a Native American style. They bury the fish to make some fertilizer. Another time after a hurricane in which they've just gotten their groceries, they have a new barrel of flour, a new barrel of corn, a new barrel of grits, and it's a hurricane that blows everything away, practically blows them away. So they have nothing to eat except the corn feed for the livestock, which they try to parch. But they also go down to the river, they gather up the dead fish while they're still fairly fresh and cook them up. And that was just, they say, oh, we missed our grits and our bread then because we just had fish alone. But you also have to understand too, the fire at this point. You kept a smoldering fire. At one time, Annie Hope's son comes to Emily and he wants some fire to take back because their fire has gone out. And she says, yes, help yourself. But how are you going to take it home? So, clever guy puts some sand in his palms and takes a bit of the smoldering charcoals left and takes it back. But that's something we don't really think about. That, you know, we complain when the electricity goes out for a few minutes. You don't think about the need to keep that fire so you will have it in case you have a hurricane and all of your ways of lighting a fire have been drenched. All right, getting back to, we'll go back up a little bit to some of the new farming of this area we don't often think about. If you look at some of these earlier ag books, rice, and of course it makes sense. Rice was farmed around this area. We had plenty of wetlands. Of course, corn was grown, and we had sugar cane, And up in the Northwest area for a while, very popular with the ladies' lunch groups when they got together, celery. And we're not talking little celery, we're talking celery about 3 feet long. So they're huge, huge celeries. So at this time we have beans growing too, and you still have some of your ample vegetables that grow kind of on their own. So that was good, but you have people who are actually have truck farms and are making a living and their livelihood through the farming too. Potatoes, Irish potatoes, white potatoes, and then you would have your sweet potatoes too. And of course you needed those potatoes for your possum, right? Yeah, sweet potatoes and possum that you needed. Okay, so closing, does anybody recognize this picture? The old Fort Pierce Hotel along the water, the first Fort Pierce Hotel. Not much of a hotel, and that was another way people made a living. Emily and her, Emily's mother and father come to this area, and they actually set up the early Edgartown, established that town, and they set up a hotel. And at one point, Emily writes that there are many boarders, and usually men, and you think about it, was probably a good deal. About $3 a week, and you would get your meals. And oftentimes they would tell Emily's mother, because she was a good cook, is, oh, I had a hole in my plate, can you refill it? But Emily talks about her mother cooking up ground venison and some fat and cooking it up like a casserole and adding breadcrumbs to the top. And I thought, boy, she's really getting kind of fancy in her cooking. No wonder she's got a popular place. So of course, any kind of job you could make so you could live your hand-to-mouth existence, and you definitely ate unusual things, plenty of grits. But the reason, another reason we're doing this Pioneer Food History today is not just in preparation for our Red, White, and Food program, but we want you to think about your own family recipes. Would love for you, if you have a recipe or a food story to tell, I would love to hear it and capture it on audio or video. And just thinking, what's in your recipe box? How many of you have a wonderful recipe that you remember this might have been your grandmother's or great-grandmother's, that every Christmas or holiday, or you smell a smell and say, oh gosh, that reminds me. So food is a very important part of our lives. Our food history is valued so that we know what kind of people, how did they live, how did they feed themselves, and for the future, keep those recipes. Everything doesn't have to be online. Where's your recipe box like we've got over here? And oh, I forgot, I did not have time to bake syrup cookies, which are what Emily mentions in her book too. She mentions baking cookies, which was a rare thing. Maybe on Christmas you would have pie or cake, but cookies. And the Seminoles come to the house, and so she gives Aunt Polly the tray of cookies, thinking Aunt Polly will take one and pass them on. And no, that did not happen. Aunt Polly takes all of the cookies and dumps them in her skirt of her dress to keep them all. And Emily was like, oh, how could she do that? So she runs to her husband, who says, you have to understand the Seminole way. Go ahead and hand one cookie to each person. Don't give her all of these. So there were many different ways these cultures would work together so well, and they would learn from each other, and they would care and help feed each other, and that makes me very proud of our Florida Pioneer food history. Are there questions? I can pass these around. Help yourself. These are actually store-bought, but they're delicious. Have a cookie. All right? Questions about our food history, about our Pioneer food history, really just before the 1900s. Does any of this make you hungry? Well, there's a Summerlin fish fry over there. If they still have it open, that is an old tradition, probably dating back to these pioneers we talk about gathering for pop-up parties, and maybe they didn't call it a fish fry. They just called it eating mullet, roasting mullet, or roasting oysters. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being interested in our history. Thank you.